the morning of October 25, 1944, began with a deceptive calm off the Philippine island of Samar. Task Unit Taffy 3 was a small, light force of 6 escort carriers and their meager screen. They were designed for air support, not for a surface brawl with the main battle fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On the bridge of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a tiny, thin-skinned destroyer escort, Commander Robert Copeland watched the horizon. He saw the dots. They were unnervingly large dots, growing rapidly. "Sir, those are not cruisers," reported the lookout, his voice tight with disbelief. The dots resolved into monsters, 4 battleships, including the colossal Yamato, 9 heavy cruisers, and 10 screening destroyers. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the core of Japan's naval might, had somehow slipped past the American main fleet. Now it bore down on the vulnerable carriers. The Roberts was 306 feet long, armed with 5-inch guns. The Yamato was 84,000 tons, bristling with 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. It was David facing Goliath, except Goliath had 9 brothers. Then came the sound. It was not the familiar crack of Allied ordnance, but a deep, throaty roar from the horizon, followed by a terrifying, high-pitched whistle. The first salvo landed, throwing up colossal geysers of water, dyed a strange chemical green, blue, and yellow by the Japanese shells. These high-caliber rounds, designed to pierce the thickest armor, tore through the air, aimed squarely at the American carriers. The desperate order came over the radio: Destroyer Escorts will attack the enemy with torpedoes. It was a suicidal charge. These ships, designed primarily to hunt submarines and protect convoys, were now ordered to steam directly into the teeth of the world's largest battleship guns. Lieutenant Everett Roberts, standing ready for the torpedo calculation, felt a cold, tight feeling settle in his stomach. His knees didn't seem to be acting quite right. They'd looked out at the massive shapes closing fast and thought they would not come out of this spot alive. It was a foregone conclusion, he realized, that the enemy would sink every one of them inside of a half hour. Yet duty demanded action. The small escorts began laying thick, black smoke screens, a desperate attempt to blind the enemy. The Roberts steamed into the teeth of the enemy's guns, the hull shuddering violently as near misses sent columns of seawater crashing over the decks. Fire Controlman Vern Kimmel, standing at his post, saw the Japanese battleships on the horizon and knew the destruction of the fleet was imminent unless they acted. Commander Copeland, knowing he was sending his ship and his predominantly teenage crew to their certain doom, gave the command. The Roberts unleashed its forward 5-inch gun, firing 275 rounds, the barrel becoming so hot its paint bubbled, turned brown, and peeled off. Then came the moment of truth. They were close enough. The torpedoes, the only weapon they possessed capable of damaging such massive targets, slid from their tubes, racing toward the enemy line. As the torpedoes ran, the scale of the Japanese firepower overwhelmed the tiny escorts. The thin-skinned ships were torn apart by 8-inch armor-piercing shells, flooding compartments and killing sailors instantly. Charles Davis died from shrapnel in the shower room. Another sailor named Carr, standing beside a gun mount, was ripped open from neck to groin by a blast. The air in the Combat Information Center was fouling with the smell of asbestos and smoke. It was a chaotic, impossible fight, a desperate gamble by a handful of brave young men. But the Battle of Samar, in all its terrifying, visceral reality, was not the beginning of this story. It was the culmination of an existential crisis that had begun years earlier, a struggle that forced the United States to build these mighty little ships in the first place. The war at sea had been lost before it began, strangled by German U-boats. By 1940, the catastrophic losses of Allied shipping were mounting into the millions of tons. 20 vessels were sunk in October alone, during what the U-boat commanders chillingly called the Night of the Long Knives. Winston Churchill, viewing the carnage from Britain, was tormented day and night by the spectacle of all these splendid ships being built, crammed with priceless food and munitions, and then being sunk 3 or 4 every day. He warned President Roosevelt that the oceans, which had historically been America's shield, now threatened to become its cage. President Roosevelt, drawing on his own experience from World War I, recognized the urgency. As early as 1940, he advocated for the mass production of a new class of vessel, a smaller, cheaper, and faster anti-submarine warfare platform, the Destroyer Escort. But Roosevelt's foresight was met with fierce, paralyzing resistance from U.S. Navy brass. The most naval officers, accustomed to the grandeur of battleships and heavy cruisers, declined to think in terms of any vessel of less than 2,000 tons. The General Board of the Navy dismissed Coast Patrol plans as unworthy of their attention. The bureaucratic infighting, compounded by Admiral Emery S. Land's argument, caused a costly delay. This inertia was later identified as a single outstanding American failure that may have prolonged the war. The result was catastrophic. Between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the summer of 1942, approximately 2,800 merchant ships were sent to the bottom of the sea. The crisis finally spurred decisive action in 1942. Naval architect William Francis Gibbs, nicknamed the Undertaker for his relentless focus, was directed to design and produce American versions of the Destroyer Escorts in large numbers and short timeframes. Using innovative construction methods like welded sections and utilizing 17 shipyards across the nation, construction time for these vessels was slashed from 1 year to 7 months. They needed tough, adaptable engines, iron seahorses, and the latest technology. This included sophisticated sonar, radar, depth charges, and the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. The first of these new vessels, smaller and more maneuverable than traditional destroyers, went to sea in January 1943. They were the answer to the U-boat menace, built to turn the tide. But these mighty little ships needed crews, and the Navy, scrambling to fill the ranks, turned to the only untapped resource left: America's youth. The call to service, galvanized by Pearl Harbor, brought a tidal wave of young men, many barely out of childhood, driven by patriotism and a desire for adventure. They were the generation that would pay the ultimate price for the initial delay. Walter Roberge, a persistent 16-year-old, finally convinced a recruiter to swear him into the U.S. Navy on July 5, 1943. He reflected later that they would take you as long as you were upright and warm, but he felt it was the right thing to do. William Reamer, a gunner's mate, summed up the basic understanding of many of these recruits. All I knew, he said, was that the pointed end of the boat went first. These were the men, teenagers and boys who, less than a year later, found themselves staring down the 18.1-inch guns of the Yamato. Their small, fast ships were now the only defense between the enemy and total disaster. Their torpedoes were fired, and they waited for the devastating reply. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, did more than just declare war against the Axis. It galvanized the nation and unleashed a tidal wave of enlistment, sweeping up the youngest generation of Americans. The Navy needed crews for its rapidly expanding fleet, and it embraced aggressive recruitment. They even used the slogan "Choose while you can" to snatch desirable recruits before the Army draft could claim them. The logistical undertaking was immense. Sprawling training facilities like the 1440-acre complex at Great Lakes, Illinois, and another at Sampson, New York, were built practically overnight. These massive complexes were designed to process more than 1 million sailors. The transition from the warmth of home to the cold, stark reality of military discipline was abrupt, often a profound shock. Barracks at Great Lakes frequently lacked heat and hot water. Fresh from civilian life, recruits endured long chow lines, strict water rationing, and insufficient clothing. Robert Homan, arriving at Bainbridge, Maryland, described the initial boot camp as a degrading experience. They were stripped naked and examined by a corpsman, who then painted a number across their chests with methiolate, which he remembered as an orange liquid, a mild iodine. They were thrown into a relentless and exhausting routine. They tied knots, studied the Blue Jackets' manual, and learned the dizzying vocabulary of the sea and the frantic hand signals of semaphore. The expectation of discipline was absolute. They were forced to keep their bunks so tightly made that a $50 would bounce off the mattress. For many, the departure was a wrenching emotional break. Terry Thomas, who enlisted at 16 after his Welsh immigrant father declared, "This means war," carried the sound of his mother's lament with him. "They're so young," she had wept, like lambs being led to the slaughter. John Bo Keeley, also 16, needed his mother's signature, but the call of patriotism was louder than any caution. Even for those who simply sought to avoid the mud and dirt of the army, choosing the Navy for its perceived cleanliness, the journey was steeped and lonely. Donald Cruz, intending to circumvent the army draft, received his draft notice on the very day he was leaving for naval training, a final bureaucratic absurdity he solved by marking the notice U.S. Navy. Pharmacist's mate Harold S. Deal, serving aboard the pervasive homesickness. They were often up before 6 o'clock in the morning, at sea for months at a time, the vast, empty ocean amplifying the feeling of isolation. This relentless pace of training and mobilization meant that the meat of the war effort was dangerously inexperienced. The average age on ships like the USS Ulvert M. Moore was a mere 17 and a half, many of whom had never even seen a city like New York before reporting for duty. As the boys trained, the ships that would carry them into the crucible of war were being forged by an industrial miracle. The naval architect William Francis Gibbs, the man they called the Undertaker for his nondescript black suit and tie, drove the Destroyer Escort program. Gibbs focused entirely on standardization and speed, finding solace only in Bach symphonies and subsisting on dry toast and coffee. His firm, Gibbs & Cox, was directed to design and produce destroyer escorts in massive numbers, acting for the first time as the central procurement agents for the Navy. Adapting to crippling shortages of steel and diesel engines, they completed machinery plans for the diesel-driven destroyer escorts in a mere 73 days. To save time, they utilized innovative construction methods, including welded sections, and employed 17 shipyards across the country, running 24 hours a day. The workforce was a mix of inexperienced men and women, with the women shouldering their full share of the precise work. The construction time for a destroyer escort, typically a year, was cut to just 7 months. 17 of these mighty little ships rolled off production lines in a single month. They were the cheap, fast, and deadly answer to the German U-boat. But even as the nation mobilized against fascism abroad, the war against internal prejudice raged at home. The U.S. Navy remained a bastion of segregation. James Graham, an African-American sailor, had already faced rejection from the Army Air Corps, where a recruiter stated flatly, "We don't take colored boys in the Army Air Corps." When he presented himself to the Navy recruiter, Graham was defiant. "I won't cook or clean up behind anyone," he declared. "My sister does that for me." Despite the desperate need for national unity, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox famously clung to the status quo. He argued that men lived in such intimacy aboard ship that they simply could not enlist Negroes above the rank of messmen. The pressure to change this policy came from the highest levels of government. Civil rights leaders like Mary McLeod Bethune and Asa Philip Randolph forced President Roosevelt's hand, resulting in Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in war industries. Eleanor Roosevelt, meanwhile, personally challenged the military's ingrained racism. She took an hour-long flight with Charles Alfred Anderson, an accomplished black aviator, proving beyond doubt that black men could fly. "Well, you can fly all right," she affirmed, an act that directly led to the establishment of the 99th Pursuit Squadron. The Navy slowly, reluctantly, began to thaw its policies. In 1942, Camp Robert Smalls, the first segregated training facility for African Americans, was established at Great Lakes. Black boots like Benjamin Garrison faced white guards who taunted them, saying, "You're going to be sorry," and "You had a good home but you left." Officers constantly warned them that they had to be better than good to succeed. 17-year-old runaway Adolph Newton recalled the nightly ordeal of falling out of hammocks onto the cold floor, lamenting, "Bodies were hitting the floor for a week." This fraught journey culminated in the commissioning of the USS Mason in March 1944. It was the first U.S. naval vessel with a predominantly black crew, a monumental and highly scrutinized step. Lieutenant Commander William M. Blackford, the white skipper, wrote home that his crew was better than average and is developing some spirit. He noted that they were anxious to make a name for themselves and actually worked harder. But James Graham, serving aboard the Mason, knew the truth. "They didn't want us to succeed," he stated, feeling the whole ship was a floating laboratory under intense observation. The Mason was immediately thrown into the Battle of the Atlantic. In late 1944, she was part of convoy NY-19, escorting a fleet of 76 U.S. Army vessels. These vessels, railroad car floats and oil barges, were manned by civilian crews described as the last scrapings available from the exhausted wartime manpower pools. They steamed directly into the teeth of the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944. This was a Category 3 storm with 90-mile-per-hour winds and seas building to heights of 60 to 80 feet. The Mason, a tiny warship, was tossed mercilessly by the immense waves. Elmo Allen described the experience as like riding the Coney Island roller coaster standing up. Water heaved up onto the deck, instantly turning to ice, coating the steel and encasing the lines. The poor little tugs and oilers could do nothing but run with the waves, hang on, and try to survive. One tug sank, and a boy was lost overboard from a nearby destroyer escort, never to be found. The decks of the Mason pitched and rolled as much as 45 degrees or more. Numb fatigue became the only escape from the constant, violent motion. Signalman James Dunn noted in his diary, "It didn't look as thought we were going to make it, but with the help of the Lord we made it safely." He concluded that they had never been in a storm as rough as that one. Despite a 17-foot crack in its deck plates and the reluctance of larger British destroyers to venture out, the Mason bravely escorted 20 smaller craft through the treacherous channels. Signalman Dunn likened this feat to a shepherd rounding up sheep. The young, predominantly black crew proved their capabilities against all odds, fighting both the enemy and the elements simultaneously. Later, when granted shore leave in Northern Ireland, Seaman William Bland found a welcome he never experienced at home. He was treated like a real American. He mused that it was funny he had to come all the way across the ocean to a foreign country before he could enjoy the feeling of being an American. Though the Mason crew was recommended for a Navy commendation for their heroism during the hurricane, the award was not granted to the black sailors. Systemic racism persisted, but they had done their job. They adapted to the peril, ensuring the vital flow of supplies and laying the groundwork for what would become the Second Reconstruction. These mighty little ships, built by the fastest methods possible and manned by the nation's youngest and most overlooked sons, were now turning the tide of the war at sea. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic began to turn, not with a single massive naval victory, but with a quiet, relentless application of technology and unified command. The crisis in March of 1943 was catastrophic. Nazi submarines sank over 500,000 tons of Allied supplies in that single brutal month. This slaughter finally shattered the Navy's institutional resistance. President Roosevelt, recognizing the need to fight with brains rather than brawn, established the 10th Fleet. This unified all anti-submarine intelligence and operations. The Destroyer Escorts, flowing rapidly from the production lines, became the backbone of the new hunter-killer groups. They were armed with sonar, radar, and the latest weapon systems, included the Hedgehog, a mortar that fired 24 contact-fused bombs in an elliptical pattern. But the war was not just against the enemy. It was fought against nature itself. The North Atlantic was a grueling green nightmare, a vast, lonely expanse of icy water and howling winds. Sailors like David Graybeal of the USS Snowdon endured decks that pitched and rolled 45 degrees or more, that made even simple tasks impossible. Bakers reported their bread dough running to one end of the pan in rough seas. Ashtrays had to be wired to stanchions, and chairs were welded down in the radio shack. Seasickness was a pervasive torture, often treated with the greasiest food available. The constant, violent motion bruised the young crews, forcing them to sleep with a leg crooked in their rack just to stay put. This constant struggle amplified the anxiety of the hunt. The catastrophic power of the ocean was brutally demonstrated by the fate of the USS Warrington, lost entirely to a hurricane. This underscored the dual threat faced by every destroyer escort crew. Quartermaster Warren Kerrigan later recalled the aftermath of a similar storm and the sinking of a vessel. He said the smell of death was everywhere. The stink was awful, with bodies visible up to the horizon and sharks circling in the icy dark waters. Survivors clung to rafts for nearly 40 hours. The sea was often the greater, more unforgiving enemy. Against this backdrop of elemental struggle, the hunter-killer groups began to win. Their success stemmed from their ability to listen, not just search. The deployment of high-frequency direction finders, known as Huff-Duff, was key. This allowed destroyer escorts to monitor German radio traffic. They could locate and target U-boat milk cows that supplied the wolf packs, crippling the German supply lines. The strategic shift culminated in the daring operation to capture the U-505. The date was June 4, 1944. 3 destroyer escorts, the USS Pillsbury, Jenks, and Chatelaine, were operating under the command of Daniel Verse Gallery. Gallery was the skipper of the carrier USS Guadalcanal in the choppy waters. The Chatelain's captain, Dudley S. Knox, reported the critical contact. He radioed. Contact evaluated as sub. Am starting attack. The Chatelaine dropped depth charges, forcing the U-505 to surface. The U-boat, commanded by Captain Lang, erupted from the water. It was lying dead ahead like a giant beached whale, foundering and spurting seawater from its damaged sides. Fighter planes circled, firing machine guns into the water to mark the target. Gallery broadcast the audacious order. I want to capture this bastard, if possible.
The American sailors, many just teenagers, instantly switched from sinking to seizing. They deliberately used non-armor-piercing bullets to prevent the U-boat from sinking immediately.
German sailors, some still in their teens, scrambled out of the hatch and dove into the churning water, crying, "Save us, comrades, save us." The American boarding party launched. Led by Lieutenant Albert L. David, the men of the Pillsbury's whaleboat raced toward the stricken submarine. The fear was a cold stone in David's stomach. They knew the U-boat would be rigged with booby traps and demolition bombs. The moment they reached the conning tower, the stench hit them. It was a suffocating, unforgettable stink of diesel, oil, bilge water, and human waste. David and his men had to work fast. The German crew had already opened the valves, and the U-boat was flooding. It was on a runaway course, listing heavily and circling tightly to starboard, like a rodeo with a cowboy trying to rope a wild horse. David secured the hatch with a chain to prevent the Germans from scuttling the vessel. Meanwhile, torpedoman Arthur Nispel, descending into the dark, greasy interior, found and disarmed 6 rigged demolition bombs. The prize was staggering. Boatswain's mate Wayne M. Pickles retrieved the confidential documents, the codebooks, and, most crucially, the Enigma machine. This intelligence coup of the war at sea resembled an old manual typewriter. The U-505, with its top-secret loot, was secured and taken in tow.
The capture was intended to be a deep secret.
Captain Gallery underscored this fact with a terse command to his young sailors: keep your bowels open and your mouth shut. The captured German sailors, like their American counterparts, were young and inexperienced. They were brought aboard the Allied ships, shivering from the cold. They were given hot showers, blankets, hot soup, coffee, and cigarettes. The shared humanity of sailors, even enemies, was palpable. As Graybeal later reflected, the sea is the great enemy, and so sailors from all over the place feel like they have something in common. The 15-day journey towing the U-505 across the Atlantic was fraught with peril. The whaleboat crew struggled to attach the tow rope in choppy seas. At one point, the tow line snapped at midnight, interrupting pleasant dreams. Donado, a sailor of immense bravery, dove overboard, knife in hand, into the dark, freezing sea to cut the line, allowing them to re-rig the tow. The intelligence gathered from the U-505, a half-ton of documents, acoustic torpedo data, and secret codebooks proved invaluable. It further crippled the German U-boat campaign, accelerating the Allied victory in the Atlantic. The Destroyer Escorts, the tiny warships initially dismissed by the Navy brass, had not only ensured the vital flow of supplies, but had delivered the definitive intelligence blow. They ensured that the oceans would remain the Allies' shield, not America's cage. The triumph in the Atlantic, secured by the relentless, grinding application of hunter-killer tactics and intelligence coups, like the capture of the U-505, allowed the Allies to breathe, but the war was far from over. As the German U-boat threat diminished, partially contained and partially crippled, the focus of naval power shifted irrevocably to the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific. The Destroyer Escorts, the mighty little ships that had proved their mettle against the U-boat wolfpacks, were now rapidly refitted and pushed west. They were thrown into a theater defined by island-hopping, immense distances, and an enemy resorting to desperate suicidal tactics. The Destroyer Escorts' primary mission remained the same: anti-submarine warfare. In the Pacific, the Japanese utilized intricate submarine scouting lines to warn of American movements toward the Marianas, Palau, and the Philippines. These lines were the nerve system of the Japanese defense, and they had to be severed. The task fell to vessels like the USS England in May of 1944. The England, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, embarked on an anti-submarine campaign of unparalleled ferocity. The hunt was a matter of relentless, calculated pressure. On May 19th, the England detected the Japanese submarine I-16. The ensuing battle was a brutal, hours-long cat-and-mouse game, culminating in a massive underwater explosion. The I-16 was gone. This was only the beginning. Over the next 12 days, the England achieved an astonishing, unprecedented feat. She sank 5 more Japanese submarines, effectively dismantling an entire critical scouting line. The success was not due to luck, but to the perfected coordination of the hunter-killer group and the sheer endurance of the crew, who lived in a constant state of high alert. Robert Curry, a 20-year-old on the USS Riddle, yearned for combat action. When he finally heard the sharp ping of sonar, followed by the depth charges and the big explosion, he understood the visceral reality of the hunt. But as Allied forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the enemy introduced a new, terrifying dimension to naval warfare. They brought in the Kaiten, or human torpedoes, and the Kamikaze suicide planes, the Destroyer Escorts, due to their speed and small size, were assigned the most dangerous duty in the Pacific, picket line duty. They were the early warning system, forming a ring around the main invasion fleets and carriers, making them the first ships in the path of the coming storm. Picket duty around Okinawa was known as the toughest duty of the war, a Bogey Highway of constant aerial threat. The USS Gendro went to battle stations 67 times during 20 continuous days. John P. Cosgrove, a yeoman, was standing on the poop deck waiting for the breakfast chow line one morning when he heard a swoosh. The sound was immediate, terrifying, and signaled the end of any routine. The attack was not always heralded by the roar of engines. Sometimes, the approach of the Kamikaze was terrifyingly silent. On Mother's Day, May 13, 1945, the USS Bright was on picket duty near Okinawa. The air was thick with humidity and tension. A Japanese plane, low and fast, was sighted, clearly committed to a suicide run. Quartermaster Edward Hinds, on the nearby USS Blessman, was already intimately familiar with the stench of burned flesh and the sight of comrades killed instantly in the mess hall by a silent, sudden bomb. On the Bright, the air suddenly whipped up, the wash from the plane so intense it flattened the sailors' dungarees against their legs. Yeoman John A. Vyram saw the pilot so close he looked like kids just like us. The guns on the Bright began blazing, the sound deafening, the smell of cordite sharp and acrid. Charles R. Cox, a young sailor, emptied a single magazine from his 20mm gun, pouring tracer fire into the fuselage. Robert F. Thomas, a gunner's mate, scored a direct hit on the plane's engine and left wing. The plane burst into flames, a curling inferno of orange and black smoke, and hurtled downward. It was so close that, even as it was engulfed, the pilot was visible, pulling the aircraft into a final desperate trajectory. The plane crashed directly into the Bright's port depth charge racks. The impact was catastrophic, but miraculously the warhead did not detonate the depth charges. The ship shuddered violently, throwing men against bulkheads, but it held. Only 2 sailors, Peter D. Vacolio and Harold E. Crane Jr., in the after-steering compartment, were injured. They had survived, but the psychological toll was immediate and profound. After the flames were extinguished and the twisted wreckage was cleared, the men would wipe the sweat from their brows and secure from battle stations, only to wait for the next swoosh, the next silent approach. The terror of the Kamikaze was compounded by the technological nightmare of the Kaiten. On July 24, 1945, the USS Underhill was northeast of Luzon. Donald Cruz, the 18-year-old water tender, was stationed in the engine room. He had lied about his age and left home for adventure. Now he was trapped in a steel box deep inside the ship, surrounded by the roar of machinery. There was no warning. Abronian was only a tremendous blast, a terrible blast that seemed to rip the world apart. The Underhill had been struck by a Katem. In the pitch black of the engine room, Cruzeff felt himself bouncing around as everything started to break loose. The pressure hull was breached. The explosion sent orange flames straight upward, a huge column of fire, and a curdling of orange and black smoke visible for miles. Roger J. Crum, an electrician's mate, was thrown onto the deck. When he recovered, he looked out across the water, 100 yards away. He saw a ship's bow. He realized, with a sickening lurch, that it was the bow of his own ship. The Underhill had been split in 2. Survivors were blown into the water, fighting for breath amidst the burning oil slick and debris. Lieutenant Nathaniel G. Benchley, commanding a nearby patrol craft, watched the scene unfold with horror. He noted how the dark mushroom of smoke hung in the sky until the last pink streaks of afterglow were blotted out by the oncoming night. The young men of the Destroyer Escorts, the sailors who had been told they were merely escorts, found themselves in the most intense combat zones of the war. They were facing an enemy that valued sacrifice over survival, whether battling the invisible threat of the U-boat in the icy Atlantic or staring down the barrel of a diving kamikaze off Okinawa. They were the indispensable, forgotten backbone of the fleet. They proved that the courage of a small ship could turn the tide of a global war. Now, we return to the hellish fighting at the Battle of Samar, October 25, 1944. The American Destroyer Escorts was spent. Having steamed into the teeth of the enemy's guns, the young crews had fired everything they had. The barrels of the 5-inch guns were so hot the paint had bubbled, turned brown and peeled off in strips. They had launched their torpedoes in suicidal runs, laid thick, choking smokescreens, and dodged the whistling, high-caliber shells that tore through their thin-skinned hulls. The USS Raymond was down to only 32 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. Fire Controlman Vern Kimmel, having fired anything that would fit through the barrel, was certain of destruction. Howard W. Fortney, watching the massive Japanese battleships on the horizon, believed the fleet was doomed. The crisis was absolute. But in the midst of the chaos, a miracle unfolded. The desperate torpedo attacks and the relentless coordinated aerial harassment from the escort carriers achieved a perfect deception, and those small planes, armed only with light anti-submarine ordnance, made repeated confusing runs. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the vastly superior Japanese fleet, was convinced he was engaging a far larger, more powerful force of heavy cruisers and fleet carriers that already lost 2 cruisers to the Destroyer Escorts' tenacity and the aerial assaults. The young American sailors, exhausted, terrified, and out of options, watched in disbelief. The enormous Japanese armada, with guns up to 18.1 inches, inexplicably began to turn away. The Japanese commander, fearing a trap and completely underestimating the speed and composition of the enemy he faced, had ordered a full retreat. The crisis was over. Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, later lamented that giving up the pursuit was like losing a prize already in hand. The sheer courage of the destroyer escort crews, combined with tactical improvisation, had saved the main American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. As the war entered its final months, the focus shifted back to the Atlantic for one last brutal campaign. Germany, though defeated on land, still possessed snorkel-equipped U-boats. These submarines were capable of remaining submerged for extended periods, posing a renewed and deadly threat. Operation Teardrop was launched to hunt these final wolf packs. On April 24, 1945, just days before Hitler's death, the USS Frederick C. Davis, known as Fightin' Freddy, was on patrol. The ship was a blur of constant motion, the decks often awash, the crews suffering the rhythmic violence of the North Atlantic. Captain Paul Just, commanding U-546, sighted the American carrier group. He knew the odds were impossible, but defiance was all that remained for the German crew. He wrote later that perspiration was on his forehead, his breath stopped, and his mouth was dry, knowing that hell awaited them as he ordered the launch of an acoustic torpedo. The torpedo struck the Davis. Signalman Peter Karetka, who had enlisted in 1940, felt the ship shudder violently. Within 37 minutes, the Frederick C. Davis split in two, cut as evenly as if someone had measured it from the center. The explosion threw men from their bunks. Roy Adcock, a ship's cook, woke up in an officer's bed, covered in 13 blankets, his blood frozen in his veins from the shock and the frigid water. The scene was one of burning, twisted wreckage and desperate survival. Karetka, pulled into the icy sea, later suffered nightmares about a sailor with a seared face, hearing them squeal as the sharks hit them. Of the 192 men aboard, 115 were killed. The sinking of the Davis, the last American warship lost to enemy action in the Atlantic, galvanized a relentless 12-hour pursuit of U-546. The destroyer escorts, including the USS Flaherty, pounded the area. Inside U-546, Captain Just experienced the counterattack as an avalanche of white gushing mass as tons of water flooded the boat. This was accompanied by terrifying cracks and rattles in the total darkness. When U-546 finally surrendered, the USS Hater rescued 32 German sailors and their skipper. Pellegrino Soriano, a sailor aboard the USS Janssen, watched the rescue, deeply impressed. It gave us a whole new outlook, that these people were human, he recalled. They were afraid. The war ended, but the battle for historical accuracy lingered for decades. The destroyer escort crews, often overshadowed by the larger destroyers and battleships, found their victories frequently unacknowledged. This was due to bureaucratic skepticism and the Navy's demand for irrefutable proof. How could a crew gather proof in the chaotic, oil-slicked aftermath of a depth-charge attack? This injustice tormented the crew of the USS Crow. In February 1945, off Point Pleasant, New Jersey, sonarman Howard Kenneth Denson detected the telltale ping of a moving U-boat. The Crow pursued the target for over 3 miles, firing 24 hedgehogs and multiple depth charges. They observed multiple underwater explosions that jarred the ship, followed by surfacing air bubbles and a heavy oil slick. They were convinced they had sunk the U-boat, but the USS Koina, arriving later and senior in command, dismissed the target as a wreck or a non-sub. The crew of the Crow was left disappointed, their victory unrecorded. Harold Muth, one of the sailors, held on to his conviction for half a century. The target was stationary, he insisted, because the Crow made it stationary. Decades later, the discovery of the U-869 wreckage off the New Jersey coast provided the final, irrefutable evidence. Found at a depth of 230 feet, the wreck contained skeletal remains and recovered artifacts like crockery dated 1942. The wreck's location was almost identical to the Crow's patrol area. German U-boat authority Axel Niestel officially amended the loss of U-8669 to February 11, 1945. He attributed the sinking to the attacks by the USS Howard D. Crow and the USS Koina. The validation, though decades late, was a testament to the persistent dedication and self-belief of the aging sailors who had fought the unseen war beneath the waves. The Destroyer Escorts, the ships that had been built quickly and cheaply to save the Atlantic, were now deemed surplus. They faced the scrap heap, their crucial role in the Pacific quickly fading from memory. Their service included dismantling Japanese scouting lines and surviving kamikaze attacks and typhoons. But a group of veterans, the Destroyer Escort Sailors Association, refused to let their legacy sink. In the twilight of their lives, they launched Operation Homeport USA. They committed to raising $275,000 to repatriate the USS Slater, the last floating destroyer escort, from Greece, where it lay decommissioned. Sam Saylor, a gunner's mate and president of the foundation, watched as the rusty old warship was towed into the Hudson River. It was a dream come true, he declared, tears blurring his vision. The Slater eventually found its permanent home in Albany, New York, towed like a grey ghost from another era. The veterans, pooling their resources and their unshakable resolve, began the arduous work of restoration. They transformed the ship with its peeling paint and silent engines into a fully restored museum and tourist attraction. The Slater stands now, not merely as a relic, but as a living legacy to the 563 ships built and the more than 1,300 men who lost their lives aboard them. Lieutenant Harold Paulson, executive officer on the Slater, recalled the young men who had manned its guns. "We gave them a job," he said. "They did their job and didn't ask any questions. They were pretty adaptable. Their resolute nature, honed by the experience of learning to live, eat, sleep, and fight on board these tiny warships, ensured their story, the story of the mighty little ship that would endure." If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.